The moment you see this man's face, you'll be horrified, and rightfully so, because this video, just like the previous ones, is going to be very disturbing. Even though this man was already sentenced to life in prison, he committed such a brutal murder behind bars that just hearing about it will shock you. Honestly, there's no need for me to over-explain, you'll feel the intensity of this story right away. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe, that's the best way you can support me. So, switch your brain into cosmic mode, because in the universe of this video, nothing will disturb you. Today's story begins a little differently. It takes place in California. Meet Yvette. She was the mother of 6 children, living in a rundown motel in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. This place was notorious for drug activity, and everyone knew how dangerous it was. But Yvette had no other options. By this point, she was already deeply addicted to drugs and alcohol. The tragedy is that Yvette hadn't always lived like this. In fact, she used to be a teacher. But her childhood was extremely difficult. She grew up with her younger sister, Danielle. From birth, Danielle suffered from serious health problems, she could barely walk. Their mother neglected both daughters, marrying a drug dealer just to survive. Despite being just a child herself, Yvette loved and cared for her little sister as if she were her own daughter. Later, Danielle would remember how kind and protective her sister had been. But when Yvette turned 10, everything got worse. Her stepfather began sexually abusing her. Even more horrifying, he threatened to hurt Danielle if Yvette refused. She endured this abuse for 2 years, until at age 12 she finally went to the police and told them everything. Her stepfather was arrested, and during the investigation, doctors confirmed that Danielle had also been assaulted. At that point, Yvette even tried to take her own life. Their mother, however, didn't believe them at all. She defended her husband and blamed her daughters instead. After that, Yvette's life spiraled completely out of control, and she turned heavily to alcohol. Even after becoming a mother herself, Yvette continued using drugs. Eventually, she was arrested, and her children were taken away. Later, her sister Danielle bailed her out of jail and pleaded with her. "Look, I'm here for you. I paid your bail. But you have to take responsibility, you have 6 kids. You can't keep living like this. You need to go to rehab." For a while, Yvette listened. But everything changed when she learned that her 6th child, still just a baby, had been born with a disability. The news devastated her, and she started drinking again. By then, Yvette was living at a motel called El Morocco. On November 7 or 8, 2011, a woman named Jane called the police, reporting something terrifying about her ex-husband. She said, "He's dangerous. He used to threaten me all the time. And now he just called me from a motel, saying he killed a woman." The police, overwhelmed with other cases, dismissed the call. The El Morocco motel was known for drugs and crime, and officers assumed it was just another junkie making things up. But everything changed on November 13th. Police were called to the motel again, this time for real. In room 19, they discovered a body. What they found was one of the most gruesome crime scenes the officers had ever witnessed. In fact, the details of how the body was left are still too disturbing to release publicly. What is known is that the woman had suffered horrific injuries. Investigators determined she had been beaten severely and tortured before she died. Prosecutors called it an act of pure evil. Several objects, including a knife and a pair of scissors, were found lodged in her body, proving that she had been tortured before death. The scene was soaked in blood. Although her face was not completely destroyed, it still took police some time to confirm her identity. Tragically, the victim was Yvette. She was only 36 years old. Her sister Danielle was the first to be notified. When it came time to arrange the funeral, the family wasn't even allowed to view Yvette's body. The injuries were too severe, and because the body had been left in the motel room for several days, it had already started to decompose. Investigators soon remembered the phone call from a few days earlier, the warning from Jane about her ex-husband. He had admitted to killing a woman at the El Morocco motel. That man's name was Jaime Osuna. The police had already heard of him, because Osuna was well known for getting into all kinds of trouble. He'd caused problems before, and on top of that, his appearance was bizarre. His face was covered in tattoos that terrified people. For example, he had a pentagram tattooed on his forehead, designs across his face that resembled the Joker's makeup, a wide smile carved into his mouth area, and even clown-like markings around one eye. Later on, he added even more tattoos to his face. Even without solid evidence, police brought him in for questioning. Naturally, he denied everything and said, "I'm not guilty of this crime, and I hope her family finds the real killer soon." But before diving into how this case unfolded, let's step back and talk a little about Jaime's past. This leads to the big question: why did he kill? Was it because of neurological damage? Or was he simply an evil person? Where exactly was the turning point that made him into what he became? As a teenager, Jaime started hanging out with gangs and using drugs. At 15, he was arrested for the first time. That's why police already knew him well. Now let's move forward to 2008. At that time, Jane, the woman who would later call police about him, was a retired psychiatric nurse who had once worked in a prison. She was 37 years old, and she had already survived a violent attack from an inmate in the past. Back then, Jaime was 20, unemployed, and on probation. They met at a gathering at Jane's house. In fact, it was Jane's nephew who had invited Jaime to the party. Jane was an attractive woman. That evening, she was celebrating her 16-year-old son's birthday. There was plenty of alcohol, and Jane started drinking. At one point, she began dancing with another man. This upset her nephew, who then asked Jaime to intimidate the man. He knew Jaime's reputation; he was known for scaring people. Jaime grabbed a knife from the kitchen and tried to stab the man. The victim wasn't seriously hurt, but Jane was terrified. She should have stayed far away from Jaime after that, but strangely, she didn't. In fact, she seemed drawn to him. By the end of the party, things got worse. Jaime attacked someone else and ended up arrested again for violating his probation. When he was released, Jane was waiting for him. That's when their relationship began. Over time, Jane grew more and more fascinated by Jaime, especially because of his bizarre appearance. By then, his face was tattooed with clown-like markings, wide grins, and the pentagram on his forehead. It was unsettling, but Jane didn't see it as frightening. To the big question, why did he kill? Was it because of neurological damage? Or was he simply an evil person? Where exactly was the turning point that made him into what he became? As a teenager, Jaime started hanging out with gangs and using drugs. At 15, he was arrested for the first time. That's why police already knew him well. Now let's move forward to 2008. At that time, Jane, the woman who would later call police about him, was a retired psychiatric nurse who had once worked in a prison. She was 37 years old, and she had already survived a violent attack from an inmate in the past. Back then, Jaime was 20, unemployed, and on probation. They met at a gathering at Jane's house. In fact, it was Jane's nephew who had invited Jaime to the party. Jane was an attractive woman. That evening, she was celebrating her 16-year-old son's birthday. There was plenty of alcohol, and Jane started drinking. At one point, she began dancing with another man. This upset her nephew, who then asked Jaime to intimidate the man. He knew Jaime's reputation; he was known for scaring people. Jaime grabbed a knife from the kitchen and tried to stab the man. The victim wasn't seriously hurt, but Jane was terrified. She should have stayed far away from Jaime after that, but strangely, she didn't. In fact, she seemed drawn to him. By the end of the party, things got worse. Jaime attacked someone else and ended up arrested again for violating his probation. When he was released, Jane was waiting for him. That's when their relationship began. Over time, Jane grew more and more fascinated by Jaime, especially because of his bizarre appearance. By then, his face was tattooed with clown-like markings, wide grins, and the pentagram on his forehead. It was unsettling, but Jane didn't see it as frightening. They went to a motel, spent the night together, and that was enough for Jane to become pregnant. Jaime was thrilled by the news. Maybe he thought he could finally be the loving father he never had himself. He promised Jane he'd be a perfect dad, and during her pregnancy, he cared for her. But after the baby was born, everything changed. Jaime relapsed into drugs and began physically abusing Jane on a regular basis. Between 2010 and 2011, he was arrested at least 3 times and repeatedly released. During that period, Jane received several threatening phone calls from him. Over the phone, he would say things like, "I'll kill you, I'll even hire a killer from behind bars." But Jane didn't take those threats seriously. She treated them as just threats. "I've already told you his full background, now we move on to the brutal events that happened while he was in custody." While investigators were still questioning him, Jaime claimed Jane was lying and that she had called him to get attention. He even denied that she was his girlfriend. "How could she marry someone like me?" he said. "She's way older than me. I'm a young man with a lot of tattoos." At that time he was 23. Detectives wondered whether Jaime was telling the truth. Maybe Yvette was not his intended target, maybe she'd been murdered because she resembled Jane. When photos were compared, there was a resemblance. But Jaime insisted, "If I wanted to kill my wife, I would have killed my wife, not someone else." He sat in jail for several years, continuing to deny everything. Then, just days before his trial, everything changed. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Jaime agreed to an interview, and during that interview he confessed everything. "I didn't know her. I met her once, and the next day I realized I had the opportunity to kill her," he said. "My wife knows I could hurt someone who looks like her. Even behind prison walls." He described how he killed Yvette. Though the journalist who conducted the interview did not publish the details, they feared releasing them would cause profound distress to Yvette's family. The young reporter who interviewed Jaime said he was stunned by the confession. Looking at him was like watching someone stare at a horrific car crash. You just couldn't look away. Even while behind bars, Jaime kept tormenting Jane. Once he sent her a dead rat through the mail. The strange thing is he couldn't have done that by himself from inside prison, someone on the outside must have helped him. After that incident, people started calling him a real-life joker. He had admitted everything in that interview, and at his trial he behaved in disturbingly bizarre ways, even laughing and appearing to mock Yvette's family. One relative told the court, "I've been in court more than 10 times, but I've never seen a face that smiled so much. I can't control other people's emotions, but I hope one day you feel grief and remorse." Instead of listening, Jaime sat shackled in a chair and mocked them. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. In that same interview, he also confessed to 2 other murders, claims that, at the time, remained unverified and existed only as his own words. He told the reporter that killing brought him more satisfaction than drugs. "Killing, I prefer it to drugs. It's even more pleasurable than sex," he said, claiming that murder gave him pleasure and fulfillment. When asked about other crimes, he said he had killed a girl when she was only 13. He offered no details, saying only that he'd dumped the body in a field. So he was arrested and given life in prison, but if you think the story ends there, you're wrong. The situation grew even darker. Jaime was classified as a highly dangerous inmate. He was never supposed to have a cellmate. He spent 23 hours a day alone, with only 1 hour of sunlight. Yet in 2019, prison officials decided to give him a cellmate, a man named Luis Romero, 44, serving time for second-degree murder. Not long after, Luis was found dead. Jaime had somehow obtained a blade and savagely dismembered him. He gouged out his eyes, ripped out his ribs and even his lungs, cut off his fingers and used them to make a necklace. Finally, he decapitated him. On the wall, Jaime had scrawled in blood, "I am a 1,000-step man." The phrase can be interpreted many ways, perhaps a claim that he could kill in 1,000 different ways, or a delusion of possessing supernatural strength. Luis's body was found on March 9, 2019. Prosecutors said the victim had suffered conscious, prolonged torture. After that, Jaime was charged again, this time with murder, torture, aggravated violence, and weapons offenses. This time he faced the death penalty. Which brings us to the question, how did the guards not know that Jaime had somehow acquired the means to remove Luis's organs and write on the wall in blood? How could such horrific acts go unnoticed within the prison? One more thing, remember, this was supposed to be a maximum security unit where cells are checked every half hour. Yet somehow the cell's camera had been covered with a bedsheet, and the guards walking past didn't notice. Whatever the how or why, he's behind bars now. If you liked the video, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Love you all, take care of yourselves. For now, goodbye.